everyone, and welcome to my channel, Babbling Books. If it's your first time here, my name is Elaine, and this is going to be my March wrap-up. So March was actually a pretty good month. I read 13 books, 1 on my Kindle, 6 on audio, and 6 physical books. And of that 13, 3 were nonfiction. So to start with, I am going to talk about the book I read on my Kindle, and that was The Never King by Nikki St. Crow. Despite this awesome cover and a really interesting premise, I didn't get along with this book. I ended up giving it a 2-star rating. So it's sort of like a dark romance with fantasy elements. So you have the Never King, who is Peter Pan, and you have the descendants of Wendy Darling. And on the 18th birthday of every Darling daughter, they are kidnapped and taken to Neverland. And when they come back, they are no longer the same. They're mentally unbalanced, I guess. I just didn't think this book was very well written. The romantic elements were really strange, in my opinion. The idea was clever. I just didn't think it was executed very well, and I'm not going to read any more books from this series. And then my audiobooks from this month. So I read a ton of Nicci French books. The first one I read was The Lying Room. And Nicci French is a husband and wife team that write thrillers, mysteries. They take place in England. And this one is about a woman named Nev. And she gets a text in the morning from her lover that she's having an affair with to come to the flat where they usually have their assignations. And when she shows up, her lover is dead. His dead body is just right there on the floor. And she decides that to keep her secret, she has to erase her entire presence from this flat. So she gives it a deep cleaning. She takes items with her, and it sort of sets off this series of rather unfortunate events. And you kind of are along for the ride as Nev tries to figure out what happened, who the killer is, and the police become involved, obviously, and her friend group sort of becomes involved. This was not one of my favorites. I thought that the decision to claim the apartment was 20 kinds of stupid, so I already was sort of on the fence. And I didn't really think the ending was that great either. And Nev's character, I mean, she spends like 4 days where it's like she doesn't sleep at all. There's tons of internal monologues where she's trying to work the problem out. So I just didn't find it to be that enjoyable of a read, but it was well written. I think the characters were pretty well fleshed out. I just didn't particularly enjoy the plot, despite the fact that it sounded amazing. And then after that, I listened to House of Corrections, also by Nicci French. So this one I really did enjoy. So you have a main character whose name is Tabitha. And Tabitha is in prison. And she has been detained because a dead body was found on her property. And this is not a spoiler, but Tabitha has to find out what happened while she's in prison. And she decides to defend herself in court. So she's having to put all these pieces together. She is not a lawyer to basically defend herself. Tabitha is not a very likable character, but you do find yourself rooting for her. And I really did enjoy this one. So if you like those, if you like thrillers that are not constantly full of action, but more sort of a slower to medium paced, putting the puzzle pieces together, figuring out, you know, who's telling the truth, who's lying, what happened, what didn't happen. This is a really good option. And then I listened to A Danger to Herself and Others by Alyssa Sheinmel. Sheinmel. This, I am pretty sure, is a YA book. And sort of like the last book I just talked about, the main character, whose name I cannot recall, she is a college student and she finds herself institutionalized. And you're pretty certain that she's an unreliable narrator or something is going on. You're not sure that you can trust what she says or even what she's thinking. And the main character doesn't understand why she's there. The accident that got her institutionalized was an accident. So why is she being penalized in her mind? Why is she being held responsible for an accident? So you slowly start to unravel what happened. You sort of start to put the pieces together of whether or not the main character is responsible, whether it was an accident or not an accident, and things like that. So I really did enjoy this one. I think I ended up giving it a 3.5-star rating because I thought it was pretty unique, but it was intriguing because you want to know, you know, you want to know, is this girl lying to everyone, you know, or is she as innocent as she claims to be? So it was intriguing. And then I listened to books 3, 4, and 5 of the White Trash Zombie series. So I've talked about this one in my last video. This is a series about a young woman who calls herself white trash. It takes place in Louisiana, and she is turned into a zombie. She works at the coroner's office. She relies on the brains from the dead bodies that come into the mortuary, to the morgue, to survive. And so there's some social aspects. There's a little bit of romance. Always a mystery with each book. I enjoyed this series because it was a departure from the normal urban fantasy with your standard werewolf, vampire, witches kind of things. But I got really tired of it. I started book 6 and decided to shelve it and maybe pick it up at some time in the future. The book series started going into a direction I wasn't really enjoying, so I may finish the series, I may not, who knows. And then on to the books I actually have physical copies of. Another Nikki French book. So this is Land of the Living. This was my favorite thriller of this month and my favorite book by Nikki French. So this woman named Abby wakes up and starts to realize that she has been taken by a man who claims to have killed many other women. She has no memory of the past few days. She doesn't know how she was taken, where she was when she was kidnapped, none of those things. So this is not a spoiler. She ends up escaping. And after she gets help and is at the police station, she starts to realize that nobody believes her. The police don't believe her. Her friends are kind of suspicious. And she has to rely on herself to figure out what happened. So she starts to trace her last few days and piece together, you know, how she was taken, who took her, and what she can do about it, and whether or not this person intends to find her again. Really, really enjoyed this one. And like all of the Nikki French books, they're not super fast-paced. They're relatively slow. I mean, in reality, I would think solving a mystery would be relatively slow. There's lots of paperwork and talking to people, lots of going from place to place and phone calls. It's not always, you know, pulling out a gun and running and fighting for your life. But I guess I like slower thrillers because I really, really enjoyed this one. And I really enjoy Nikki French's books in general. And then I read a poetry collection called What We Buried. So I am not a huge fan of poetry. I'm trying to discover what kind of poetry that I enjoy, and because there are some poems I absolutely do adore, but I have never found a poet where even I like 80 to 90% of their poems. So I'm on a journey to find some poets that I love. And I would like to read one of my favorite poems from this collection. It's called The Architect. I could build cities on the earth in your eyes, draw the structure of your jawbone, trace the staircase of your teeth. I didn't go to school for this, but when I saw your face, I wondered if architecture was sleeping latent in my bones. I wondered if I was born to know the blueprints of you. I really enjoyed that poem. Something about it I thought was just beautiful. This author, there's tons of references to teeth and tongues. It's a very visceral, almost physical poetry collection. It is not gentle. It's not soft. It is not carefree or flowing. It's just earthy. I don't think that I'm going to look for any other collections by this author. There's 54 poems in here, and out of 54, I enjoyed 7 of them. So not exactly the greatest ratio, but if you enjoy poetry, this may be something that you enjoy. And then I read this nonfiction book called Princess, a true story of life behind the veil in Saudi Arabia. So this is the story of a woman whose father is one of the princes. So a brother to the Saudi Arabian king in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So this was first off, it's the princess became friends with an American woman living in Saudi Arabia. And the princess asked this woman if she would write her story. So it's written by Jean Sasson, but it is the story of, that is hilarious. I cannot remember her name. What is her name? Sultana, Princess Sultana. So if you were interested in what it's like to be the top tier of in society in Saudi Arabia and a woman, this is a great option. There are lots of little interesting tidbits where you can peer behind the veil of what it is like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, such as how weddings are conducted, veiling, marriages, relationships between women, what it's like to be a wife, to be a mother, it covers pretty much all of the bases. There's 2 more books. The next one is about Princess Sultana's daughters. I do want to read that one, but this is great. If you like reading about the lives of women, especially women whose lives are nothing like yours, this is a really great option, and it was pretty well written. And I think that the Princess Sultana did her best to be honest, because there are some times where she admitted to some rather embarrassing things and some occurrences that she was ashamed of, some choices that she made where she was less self-aware, less aware of the world, and she made some pretty terrible decisions that affected other people. So I do feel that she tried to be honest, which is very important when you're reading a memoir. And then I finally finished this. It took me over a month. And it is A World Undone, the story of the Great War, 1914 to 1918, by G.J. Meyer. So this book is just absolutely massive. But it was fantastic. So It's chronological, which I think is really important when you're reading a history. So each section covers a year. So it starts with 1914 and it goes on to 1918. And the author is very, very clear when he writes. But there's so much information in here that there is no way that you're going to absorb all of it. But the highlights of this book are, for instance, there are photographs throughout the book rather than just having a section in the center where you have to, flip to it and find it. So I really enjoyed that because as you were reading, there was a photograph about what you were reading. The other absolutely amazing thing about this book are these sections called background. So while you're reading about the Serbian uprising before the war officially started, there's a background section about the Serbs, the history and information that the author thinks is relevant background. And that continues throughout the book. So German generals or what is happening to the Jewish population. I thought the background sections were absolutely amazing because you get some social history and a more well-rounded idea of what is happening rather than just reading about military strategy or what's happening in the front lines, things like that. So the background sections were fantastic. My only complaint with this book is that it is very, very heavily focused on the Eastern and Western fronts. So the Caucasus and the Balkans, the Middle East, those things are mentioned, but it's maybe only 15 to 20% of the book, whereas 80% of it focuses on what's happening on the Western and the Eastern fronts. So I think more reading would be necessary to get a more well-rounded understanding of the First World War. But this is a great place to start. Highly, highly recommend it if you are interested in this topic because I thought it was fantastic. And then another nonfiction book is Love in a Headscarf. Muslim Woman Seeks the One, written by Shelina, Zahra, I think that's a J. Janmohamed. So this is the memoir, the true story of a Muslim woman in Britain who decides that she's going to find the one by having an arranged marriage by using matchmakers. This was wonderful. It was incredibly enlightening. There was a lot of discussion about she was a very devout Muslim, about what the Quran preaches and what her culture expects and how sometimes those two things clash and they do not mix. And what the Quran says about marriage and relationships and the role of a woman and the role of a husband in comparison to what her culture expects of her. So it was a very wonderful, wonderful book. I highly, highly recommend it if you are looking for nonfiction. What it's like to be a modern Muslim woman in the West. Any curiosity you have about the Muslim religion, that is talked about very much in here. Or if you're interested in the idea of what it's like to have an arranged marriage or using matchmakers, that was very interesting as well. The author is humorous. It says right here, at the age of 13, I knew I was destined to marry John Travolta. One day he would arrive on my North London doorstep, fall madly in love with me, and ask me to marry him. Then he would convert to Islam and become a devoted Muslim. So her culture is also clashing with her very modern Western upbringing. So highly recommended. It was fantastic. And then I read Hijab and Red Lipstick by Yousra Imran. This book has so many trigger warnings that I don't even know where to start. Compared to the other 2 books that I read about Muslim women, this book had no joy. It was just so heavy. All of the terrible things that we hear about in the West about Muslim women in their own countries, or their own countries, in their countries that are predominantly Muslim is what I should say, excuse me. It's all of those things. Fathers that don't listen, that are so incredibly controlling, brothers that treat their sisters terrible simply because they're female, no rights, nobody listening to you, no joy, no happiness. I mean, it was so negative. If this was the only thing I had ever read about the lives or the life of Muslim women, I would think that every Muslim woman was some horrible, oppressed person that never experienced joy. And that's not true. So be aware if you choose to read this, that it is I think it's an incredibly negative portrayal. But it was written by a Muslim woman, so she would know better than I would of whether or not this story has any factual basis or any accuracy, and she claims that it does. So this is a part, I guess, of this is something that a lot of Muslim women do experience, but it was just too negative for me. I was very unhappy when I was reading it. I was very unhappy when I finished reading it. But that's really no fault of the book. That's just my personal experience with it. But like I said, trigger warnings for physical abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, child molestation. I mean, it's everything you possibly could think of is in here. Oh, and you know what? Now that I mention it, I also would like to say this book also has a trigger warning for sexual assault and yes, sexual assault of a child. And oh, there's also some honor killings in here as well. And then on to the only book that I DNF'd for the month is The Meg. So I love books that take place in extreme environments, and deep in the ocean, Antarctic, the Amazon rainforest, anything like that. And I also like books about sharks. So this is right up my alley. I actually saw the movie first, and I was very excited to read it because, usually if you like the movie, the book's even better. It was not. There's only 2 women in this book. One of them is portrayed as a man using social climbing disloyal bitch, basically. And the other woman is a resentful, man-hating bitch. And I didn't really enjoy that. It's very flat. There was barely any dimension to the book. I think I made it under 100 pages, and I was just completely bored, highly irritated. I like the movie better, so this was DNF'd. So that is all of the books that I read in March. I had a pretty good reading month. I particularly enjoyed the 3 nonfiction books that I read, and some of Nicci French's thrillers. I enjoyed those. And I am really hoping to continue into April with as many wonderful books as I read in March, because that would be a really good month. So Anyway, that's it. Let me know if you've read any of these. If you have any recommendations for, I would say slower paced thrillers, please drop a comment below. And if you have any recommendations for poetry collections, or books that focus on the lives of Muslim women, or books that have anything to do with women during World War I. I've been on a search and I can't find anything. I would like to read about the nurses and other jobs that women had in World War I near the front lines. But they're very difficult to find. I haven't been able to find anything. So if you know of something, please feel free to comment down below. I would really appreciate it. And let me know what your favorite reads were this month. I'm always looking to add things to my TBR. So thank you. Bye.